Mr. Henderson, I'm afraid your recreational sports facility is in complete violation of county zoning ordinances and will need to be removed immediately. That's what Brenda Thornfield would tell me 6 months later, standing in my driveway with a stack of legal papers and the kind of smug expression that makes you understand why people snap. But she had no idea that every word she spoke was being recorded. She had no idea that I'd spent 3 decades designing golf courses for people who made her annual HOA salary in a weekend. And she definitely had no idea that the violation she was looking at was about to become the most legally bulletproof middle finger in suburban history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You want to know how a simple grass fine turned into a war that would reshape an entire neighborhood? It started with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, and the sound of my own laughter echoing through an empty house. Let me paint you a picture of Meadowbrook Estates, because you need to understand the battlefield to appreciate the victory. Imagine the most aggressively manicured suburb you've ever seen, where every mailbox is regulation black with brass numbers, every driveway is precisely edged, and every blade of grass seems to stand at attention like tiny green soldiers. The kind of place where grown adults argue about fence heights and paint colors with the passion of wartime generals, where homeowners associations wield their little scraps of power like medieval lords ruling over kingdoms of Kentucky bluegrass and decorative mulch. I'd lived there for 18 months, ever since my wife Sarah passed and I sold our place in Colorado. Retirement wasn't treating me well. Turns out designing championship golf courses for 30 years doesn't prepare you for the crushing boredom of suburban leisure. I was 58 years old, had more money in the bank than I knew what to do with, and absolutely nothing to occupy my mind except watching Netflix and maintaining a lawn that, frankly, I couldn't have cared less about. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, certified mail, which should have been my first warning. The return address read Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, in that sterile corporate font that screams bureaucratic authority. I remember setting it on my kitchen counter next to my coffee mug, a faded Augusta National souvenir from a course I'd consulted on 15 years earlier, and staring at it like it might explode. When I finally tore it open, the first thing that hit me was the letterhead, full color, embossed, with a little logo of a house surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges. Professional enough to intimidate most people, I suppose. But then I read the content, and I actually laughed out loud. Not a chuckle, a full-throated laugh that echoed through my empty kitchen and probably confused my neighbor's dog. Notice of violation, covenant enforcement, it began, in bold letters that took up half the page. Below that, in smaller but equally aggressive font, property address 2847 Maple Ridge Drive. Violation code LM001. Description: lawn maintenance below community standards. Grass height exceeds maximum allowable limit of 2.5 inches by approximately 1.5 inches as measured on September 15, 2024. I had to read that twice. My grass was too tall, by 1.5 inches. Someone had actually taken a ruler to my lawn and determined that my Kentucky bluegrass was in violation of suburban law. But wait, it gets better. Fine amount, $500. Payment due within 15 days of receipt. Failure to pay will result in additional penalties and potential legal action. Additionally, the violation must be remedied within 5 business days, or additional daily fines of $50 will be assessed. $500 for grass that was, according to their own measurement, 4 inches tall instead of 2.5. I walked outside and looked at my front yard with fresh eyes. It looked like grass. Green, healthy, slightly wavy in the September breeze, maybe a little longer than the crew-cut precision of my neighbor's lawns, but hardly the suburban wasteland this letter made it sound like. That's when I noticed her,
Brenda Thornfield, standing at the edge of her driveway across the street, pretending to check her mailbox while obviously watching my house. She was exactly what central casting would order for suburban HOA president. Mid-50s, shoulder-length blonde hair that never moved in the wind, pressed khaki pants, and a polo shirt that probably cost more than some people's car payments. The kind of woman who uses phrases like property values and community standards the way other people use actual curse words. Our eyes met across the street, and she gave me this little wave. Not friendly, territorial, like a dog marking its territory, but with manicured nails and a Homeowners Association badge. I waved back and held up the letter. Even from 40 feet away, I could see her smile. That night, I did what any rational person would do when faced with bureaucratic insanity. I researched, and what I found in the Meadowbrook Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions document was a masterpiece of suburban fascism. 47 pages of microscopic regulations covering everything from acceptable window treatments, white or off-white only, to garbage can placement, no more than 18 inches from the curb but not touching the sidewalk, to, and I kid you not, the specific angle at which American flags could be displayed. The lawn maintenance section was particularly thorough. Grass height, maximum 2.5 inches, minimum 1.5 inches. Acceptable grass types, Kentucky bluegrass, fine fescue, or approved hybrid combinations. Edging requirements, all lawn areas must be edged within 2 inches of sidewalks, driveways, and flower beds. Watering restrictions, no visible pooling, no watering between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. during summer months. But here's the thing that caught my attention, buried in subsection 14.7 under recreational facilities. Homeowners may install recreational sports facilities on their property provided such installations comply with county zoning regulations, do not exceed noise ordinances, and enhance rather than detract from overall neighborhood aesthetics. I read that line 3 times. Then I walked to my home office and pulled out my laptop and started making phone calls because Brenda Thornfield had just made a very expensive mistake. She'd picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to turn her own rules against her. You see, most people would have paid the fine. Most people would have cut their grass, apologized for the violation, and lived in fear of future measuring tape incidents. Most people don't have 3 decades of experience navigating municipal zoning laws, don't have a contact list full of contractors who specialize in impossible projects, and don't have enough retirement savings to fund a very expensive, very public, and very legal revenge. But I'm not most people. And as I sat in my office that night, sketching preliminary designs on the back of Brenda's ridiculous violation letter, I realized that my boring retirement was about to become a lot more interesting. The question wasn't whether I could turn my front yard into something that would make Brenda Thornfield's perfectionist heart explode. The question was whether I could do it in a way that was so thoroughly legal, so meticulously planned, and so devastatingly effective that she'd never recover from the humiliation. I looked out my window at her house across the street, where every light was off except the one in what I assumed was her home office. Probably writing more violation letters, measuring more grass, plotting more ways to make her neighbors' lives miserable. She had no idea what was coming.
These measurements will be submitted as evidence in our enforcement proceedings, Mr. Henderson, so I suggest you observe the process carefully. That's what Brenda told me as she knelt in my driveway like some kind of suburban crime scene investigator, her measuring device clicking against my concrete like a metronome of madness. But what she didn't know was that I was already 3 steps ahead, my phone recording every humiliating second from my front window. What she didn't know was that her little performance was about to become the opening act of the most expensive lesson in hubris that Meadowbrook Estates had ever witnessed.
What she didn't know was that every measurement she took, every photograph her cronies snapped, every condescending word that came out of her mouth was building the foundation for her own destruction. But let me back up and tell you how we got to this moment, because the devil is always in the details, and Brenda Thornfield was about to discover that some devils have architectural licenses. 3 days had passed since I received the violation letter, and I hadn't cut my grass. Not out of laziness or defiance, mind you, but because I was conducting my own investigation. You want to beat a system? You study it first. And what I discovered about Brenda Thornfield's enforcement patterns would have made a detective proud. She operated on a precise schedule. Every Tuesday and Friday morning at exactly 7 a.m., she began what I came to call her patrol rounds. Armed with a digital camera, a tablet computer, and what appeared to be a professional-grade measuring device, she would systematically document every potential violation in our 23-house neighborhood. I'd watched her from my kitchen window for 3 mornings straight, timing her movements, noting her methods, building a profile of someone whose need for control bordered on pathological. The woman was thorough, I'll give her that. She photographed mailboxes that were a half-inch too far from the curb. She measured the height of decorative garden stones. She actually got down on her hands and knees to inspect the edging along Mrs. Patterson's flower beds with what looked like a jeweler's loop. This wasn't HOA enforcement. This was suburban surveillance theater performed for an audience of herself. But Tuesday morning was different. Tuesday morning, she brought backup. I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when I saw them approaching. Brenda, in her standard-issue khakis and navy polo, flanked by 2 other people I recognized as board members. Janet Mills from 2851 Maple Ridge, a retired librarian who treated HOA bylaws like sacred texts, and Robert Chen from 2834, a middle manager at some insurance company who'd found his life's purpose in neighborhood politics. They moved across the street toward my house with the kind of determined stride that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. The doorbell rang at 7:12 a.m. exactly. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Brenda said when I opened the door, her voice carrying that particular blend of false pleasantness and barely contained authority that only comes from years of wielding petty power. I looked past her to Janet and Robert, who stood slightly behind her like backup singers waiting for their cue. Janet held a digital camera with a lens that seemed absurdly oversized for photographing grass. Robert clutched a tablet and wore an expression of such serious concentration you'd think we were conducting a murder investigation. "Measurement?" I asked, playing dumb. I wasn't aware that was part of the process. "Oh, it absolutely is," Brenda replied, pulling out what I can only describe as the most sophisticated grass measuring device I'd ever seen. It looked like a cross between a surveyor's tool and something NASA might use to measure moon rocks. Section 12.4 of our enforcement procedures allows for on-site verification of reported violations. We take our responsibilities very seriously here in Meadowbrook Estates. What happened next was simultaneously the most ridiculous and most revealing 15 minutes of my entire experience with suburban homeowners associations. Brenda positioned herself at the edge of my driveway and began what I can only call a forensic examination of my lawn. She moved methodically across the grass, stopping every few feet to take measurements, while Janet photographed the process from multiple angles. Robert followed behind them, typing notes into his tablet with the diligence of a court reporter. 4.2 inches here, Brenda announced, as if she were discovering evidence of war crimes. Janet, make sure you get a close-up of the measuring device display. Got it, Janet replied, the camera clicking rapidly. Should I include the street address in the background? Absolutely. Chain of custody is crucial in these matters. Chain of custody. For grass measurements. I stood on my front porch watching this performance with a growing sense of disbelief. These people had turned lawn maintenance into an episode of CSI Suburbia. But then something interesting happened. As they worked their way across my yard, I began to notice other neighbors emerging from their houses. Mrs. Patterson from next door stepped onto her porch with her morning coffee, watching the proceedings with obvious fascination. The young couple from 2839, I think their name was Rodriguez, stopped their morning jog to stare. Even old Mr. Walsh from the corner house had wandered out to his mailbox, though he clearly had no mail to collect. And the expressions on their faces weren't supportive of Brenda's little demonstration. They looked embarrassed, confused. Some of them looked angry. "This is quite a process you have here," I said to Brenda as she continued her measurements. "Very thorough." She looked up from her device, and for just a moment I caught something in her expression, not just the satisfaction of someone enforcing rules, but something deeper, something that looked almost hungry. "Community standards don't maintain themselves, Mr. Henderson. Someone has to be vigilant." 4.7 inches in this section, she announced to her team. "Janet, make sure you note that this represents a 94% violation of the established maximum height requirement." 94% violation. She had actually calculated a percentage for how wrong my grass was. That's when Mrs. Patterson decided to speak up. "Brenda, honey, don't you think this is a bit much? I mean, it's just grass." Brenda straightened up from her crouched position, and I watched her transform. The false pleasantness evaporated, replaced by something sharp and cold. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice now carrying no pretense of friendliness, "property standards depend on everyone maintaining their obligations. When one homeowner decides they're above community standards, it affects us all. I'm sure you understand." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't backing down. "Well, I understand that you're measuring this man's grass with what looks like space equipment at 7 in the morning, and frankly, it seems a little excessive." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other neighbors had stopped pretending they weren't watching. This had become a public confrontation, and everyone knew it. Brenda looked around at the growing audience, and I could see her calculating. This wasn't going according to her script. Her little demonstration of power was turning into something else entirely. "We're simply following established procedures," she said, but her voice had lost some of its authority. "Mr. Henderson received a violation notice, and we're documenting the extent of the violation for our records. $500 for grass that's an inch too tall. That's what we're documenting here." I heard someone whistle softly. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head and muttered something in Spanish that didn't sound complimentary. She shot me a look that could have melted steel, but she was committed to her performance now. She finished her measurements, Janet took her photographs, and Robert completed his notes. The whole process took another 10 minutes, during which the audience of neighbors continued to grow. Finally, Brenda packed up her equipment and prepared to leave. But as she reached the edge of my property, she turned back to face me. "You have 48 hours remaining to remedy this violation, Mr. Henderson. After that, daily fines will begin accruing. I hope you'll make the right choice." She walked away, her backup team trailing behind them like disappointed understudies who'd realized they'd signed up for the wrong show. I stood on my porch for a long moment after they left, aware that half my neighbors were still watching. Finally, Mrs. Patterson broke the silence. "Mike," she called over, "if you need help dealing with this nonsense, let me know. My late husband was a lawyer, and I've got some ideas about these people." Other neighbors nodded agreement. The Rodriguezes gave me a thumbs up. Even old Mr. Walsh shuffled over to tell me he thought Brenda had lost her damn mind. As I walked back into my house, I realized something had shifted. Brenda's little demonstration hadn't intimidated anyone. It had exposed her. The neighborhood had just watched their HOA president conduct a forensic investigation of grass height with the seriousness of a federal crime, and they'd found it ridiculous. But more importantly, I'd learned something crucial about my opponent. This wasn't just about rule enforcement for Brenda. This was about,
Tommy, I need you to listen carefully, because I'm about to describe the most legally bulletproof act of suburban warfare ever conceived. That's the phone call I made at 11:30 on Wednesday night, 3 days after Brenda's measuring tape circus, when I finally understood exactly how I was going to destroy her little kingdom of control. But the real breakthrough had come 6 hours earlier, when I discovered that the same HOA covenant that gave Brenda the power to fine me for tall grass also contained the exact legal framework I needed to turn my front yard into her worst nightmare. You see, most people read HOA documents looking for what they can't do. But when you've spent 30 years navigating municipal zoning laws and construction permits, you learn to read between the lines. You learn to find the spaces where bureaucrats accidentally left doors wide open. And Brenda Thornfield, in her infinite wisdom, had just handed me the keys to the most expensive revenge plot in HOA history. The research phase began immediately after Brenda's measurement performance. I'd watched her little show, seen how the neighbors reacted, and realized that this was bigger than just my grass violation. This was about breaking the stranglehold that petty suburban tyrants like Brenda held over entire communities. This was about proving that there were limits to what people would tolerate, even in the name of property values and community standards. I started with the basics, the original Meadowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions, filed with the county in 1987. 47 pages of single-spaced legalese that read like the constitution of a fascist microstate. But then I moved on to the amendments, the addendums, the board resolutions, and the enforcement procedures that had been tacked on over the decades like layers of bureaucratic sediment. By Wednesday afternoon, my dining room table looked like the war room of a legal conspiracy. Documents spread across every surface, sticky notes marking important sections, highlighter marks creating a rainbow of regulatory madness. I had copies of municipal zoning ordinances, county permit requirements, state laws governing homeowners associations, and even federal regulations about recreational facilities. And that's when I found it. Section 14.7. Buried deep in Amendment C from 1994, probably added by some long-forgotten board member who thought they were being reasonable. Homeowners may install recreational sports facilities on their property, provided such installations comply with all applicable county zoning regulations, do not violate municipal noise ordinances, and enhance rather than detract from the overall aesthetic character of the neighborhood. I read that sentence 5 times before the full implications hit me. Then I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. You want to know what a recreational sports facility is, according to county zoning regulations? It's any permanent or semi-permanent structure designed for athletic activity or sport-related recreation. And what had I been designing for the past 30 years? Golf courses, championship-level, PGA tournament-worthy regulation golf courses. I grabbed my phone and called the county zoning office. "Hi, this is Mike Henderson. I need to know about permits for residential recreational sports facilities." The clerk on the other end sounded bored. "What kind of facility?" "A putting green, possibly with some decorative water features and sand bunkers." "Size?" I looked out my window at my front yard. "Approximately half an acre." That would fall under recreational facility permits. You'd need to submit plans showing compliance with setback requirements, drainage specifications, and aesthetic impact assessments. Processing time is typically 4 to 6 weeks. And once approved, there wouldn't be any restrictions on maintenance or appearance. As long as you comply with the approved plans and don't violate noise ordinances, no. These facilities are considered private recreational amenities. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately called my old friend Tommy Castellanos. Tommy had been my go-to contractor for 15 years, a master of impossible projects who'd helped me build courses on mountainsides, in deserts, and once, memorably, on what used to be a toxic waste site in Nevada. "Mike!" Tommy's voice boomed through the phone. "How's retirement treating you?" "It just got a lot more interesting, Tommy. I need a favor, a big one." "I'm listening." "How would you like to build the most beautiful, most legally protected, and most infuriating residential golf course in the history of suburban America?" There was a pause. Then Tommy started laughing. "You know what, Mike? I've been waiting 30 years for a phone call like this. Tell me everything." I spent the next 2 hours walking Tommy through the situation. Brenda's violation letter, the measuring tape incident, the neighborhood's growing resentment of HOA overreach, and most importantly, the loophole that would make it all possible. "So let me get this straight," Tommy said when I finished. "This HOA president fined you $500 for grass that was an inch too tall, then showed up at your house with what sounds like a surveying team to document your criminal lawn maintenance?" "Pretty much." "And now you want to turn your front yard into Augusta National just to mess with her?" "Not just to mess with her, Tommy, to break her, to show everyone in this neighborhood that there are limits to what petty tyrants like Brenda can get away with. To prove that sometimes the best response to unreasonable authority is spectacular, legal, and very public non-compliance." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "You know this is going to cost a fortune, right? We're talking about a complete landscape transformation, professional-grade construction, water features, irrigation systems, drainage, probably some kind of lighting if you want to use it in the evenings." "Tommy, I spent 30 years making rich people's golf fantasies come true. I've got more money sitting in retirement accounts than I know what to do with, and I just watched a grown woman measure my grass with forensic equipment. Money is not an issue." "Well, in that case," Tommy said, and I could hear the grin in his voice, "let's build something that'll make them wish they'd never heard of homeowners associations." Thursday morning, I drove to Tommy's office in the industrial district across town. His company, Castellanos Construction, specialized in high-end landscaping and recreational facilities. The walls were covered with photographs of projects he'd completed over the years: resort golf courses, private putting greens, elaborate water features that looked like they belonged in botanical gardens. "All right, Mike," he said, spreading a large sheet of drafting paper across his desk. "Show me what you're thinking." I pulled out the sketches I'd been working on since Tuesday night. Basic layouts, measurements of my property, rough ideas for elevation changes and water placement. But as we started talking, the project began to evolve into something much more sophisticated. "The key," I explained, "is that everything has to be absolutely perfect from a technical point of view. This isn't just about building a golf course. It's about building a golf course that's so obviously professional, so clearly legitimate, that no one can argue it's anything other than what it claims to be." Tommy nodded, making notes on the margins of my sketches. "What about the aesthetic impact requirement in the county regulations?" "That's the beautiful part. We're going to make it gorgeous, not just functional, but stunning, the kind of thing that would make Better Homes and Gardens want to do a feature story. Because here's what Brenda doesn't understand about recreational sports facilities. They're supposed to enhance property values, not detract from them." We worked through the morning, refining the design, calculating costs, discussing timelines.
What emerged was a plan for a putting green that would cover roughly 60% of my front yard, complete with 4 different pin positions, 2 sand bunkers, a small water hazard that would double as a decorative pond, and professional-grade lighting for evening use. "The irrigation system alone is going to be a work of art," Tommy said, sketching in the water lines. "We'll need to coordinate with the utility companies, get proper permits for the electrical work, and probably bring in a landscape architect to make sure everything meets the aesthetic requirements." "What's the timeline?" "If we start the permit process today, we could have approvals within a month. Construction would take another 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we run into utility complications." "And the cost?" Tommy did some quick calculations. "All in, probably somewhere around $40,000, maybe $50,000 if we go with the premium lighting package." $50,000. To most people, that would be a mortgage payment, a year of college tuition, or a new brand new car. To me, it was the price of the most satisfying middle finger in the history of suburban warfare. "Do it," I said. That afternoon, Tommy's team began the
Jesus Christ, Mike. This is either the most beautiful thing I've ever built, or we're both going to end up in federal prison. That's what Tommy whispered to me at 4:23 a.m. as we watched his crew put the finishing touches on what had once been my humble front lawn and was now a putting green that would make the Masters tournament jealous. But 3 weeks earlier, when the county permits finally came through with every single approval stamp intact, I'd realized that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about creating something so spectacular, so undeniably legitimate, and so breathtakingly beautiful that even Brenda's measuring tape obsession would be powerless against it. What started as a petty response to a grass violation had evolved into the kind of precision operation that required military timing, industrial equipment, and the darkest corner of night to pull off without interference. You think you've seen suburban warfare? You haven't seen anything until you've watched a team of professional landscapers transform half an acre into championship golf terrain while an entire neighborhood sleeps, completely unaware that their morning commute is about to become very, very different. The planning for Operation Bentgrass had taken 3 weeks of meticulous coordination that would have impressed Pentagon logistics officers. Tommy and I had mapped out every detail with the precision of a bank heist. Delivery schedules timed to avoid neighborhood patrol routes, equipment positioned to minimize noise pollution, work crews briefed on emergency protocols if anyone tried to interfere with a legally permitted construction project. The permits had arrived on a Monday. 23 separate approvals from county zoning, municipal utilities, environmental services, and even the fire department, who had to sign off on the water feature placement. Each document bore the official seals and signatures that transformed what Brenda would undoubtedly see as an act of suburban terrorism into something that was not just legal, but encouraged by local government. "Mike," Tommy had said when we reviewed the final plans, "I've been in construction for 25 years, and I've never seen a more thoroughly documented recreational facility permit in my life. You could build this thing on the White House lawn with this level of approval." The paperwork was bulletproof, but the real challenge was the construction itself. You can't build a championship-quality putting green during normal business hours without attracting attention, and attention was the last thing we wanted before the grand reveal. The solution was what Tommy called guerrilla landscaping, a complete transformation executed under cover of darkness with the efficiency of a special forces operation. Tuesday night, I barely slept. Every hour, I checked my phone for updates from Tommy's advance team, who were conducting what they called neighborhood reconnaissance. Translation, making sure Brenda wasn't conducting any late-night patrol rounds that might interfere with our timeline. At 2:15 a.m. Wednesday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Package delivery incoming. Operation Bentgrass is a go." I made coffee and positioned myself at my front window, watching the street like a general observing a battlefield. The neighborhood was dead silent, every house dark except for the occasional porch light or security lamp.
Even the streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, as if the universe itself was conspiring to provide cover for what was about to happen. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the first truck appeared at the end of Maple Ridge Drive. No headlights, just running lights and the soft diesel rumble of a heavy commercial vehicle moving slowly through suburbia. It was followed by two more trucks, each one longer than the last, their cargo beds stacked with pallets wrapped in protective plastic that glimmed in the moonlight. Tommy's crew materialized out of the darkness like landscaping ninjas. 8 men dressed in dark work clothes, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from years of working together on impossible projects. They unloaded equipment with choreographed precision. Industrial sod cutters, hydraulic lifts for moving the heavier pallets, and what looked like enough irrigation supplies to water a small farm. The sound was unavoidable. Industrial equipment, no matter how carefully operated, makes noise. But Tommy had planned for that, too. The work was timed to coincide with the early morning freight train that passed through town at 3:15 a.m., its rumble masking the worst of the construction noise. I watched from my window as my front yard was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. First, the existing grass was removed in perfect rectangles, each piece of sod peeled away like carpet tiles. Then came the earth moving. Tons of specialized soil blend that had been engineered specifically for championship golf course construction, spread and graded with laser precision to create the subtle elevation changes that would make the putting green both challenging and visually stunning. The irrigation system went in next, a network of underground pipes and sprinkler heads that looked like it belonged at a professional golf course rather than a suburban front yard. Tommy's team worked by flashlight and headlamp, each man knowing his role so well that they barely needed to communicate. But the real magic happened when the bent grass arrived. Championship bent grass isn't something you pick up at the local garden center. This was the same variety used at Augusta National, shipped overnight from a specialty grower in Georgia who normally only worked with professional golf courses and private clubs. Each pallet contained perfectly maintained sod that had been grown under controlled conditions for 2 years, creating a playing surface that was both beautiful and functionally superior to anything in the neighborhood. Tommy supervised the installation personally, ensuring that each piece of sod was positioned with mathematical precision. The seams were invisible, the grade was perfect, and the overall effect was so flawless that it looked like it had been there for decades rather than hours. At 4:30 a.m., the water feature went active. What had been a depression in the landscaping suddenly filled with water, creating a small pond that reflected the streetlights like a mirror. Underwater lighting brought the feature to life, casting ripples of blue light across the newly installed grass. The sand bunkers were the final touch. 2 perfectly sculpted depressions filled with specialized golf course sand that Tommy had imported from Michigan. Each bunker was shaped and raked by hand, creating hazards that looked like they'd been designed by a master architect rather than installed in the middle of suburbia. By 5:15 a.m., the transformation was complete. Tommy's crew packed their equipment with the same silent efficiency they'd displayed during construction, loading everything back onto the trucks and disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness as quickly as they'd appeared. I stood in my front yard as the sun began to rise, surveying what had once been my humble lawn and was now something that belonged in a golf magazine. The putting green stretched across 60% of my front yard, its surface so perfect it looked like green velvet. The water hazard caught the morning light and threw it back in dancing patterns. The sand bunkers were sculpted works of art, and at the center of it all, positioned exactly where Brenda parked her white Lexus during her morning patrol rounds, stood a regulation golf flagstick bearing a small flag with the number 1 embroidered in gold thread. The cost had been astronomical. $53,000 for materials, labor, permits, and what Tommy diplomatically called expedited installation services. But looking at the result, it was worth every penny. This wasn't just a putting green. It was a statement, a masterpiece, a work of art that happened to be specifically designed to drive one particular HOA president absolutely insane. I made fresh coffee and settled into my favorite chair by the front window, waiting for the neighborhood to wake up. The first jogger appeared around 6:30 a.m., stopped dead in his tracks when he saw my yard, then actually walked onto my property to get a closer look. I watched him circle the putting green twice, shaking his head in amazement. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house at 7 a.m. to retrieve her newspaper and nearly dropped it when she saw what had happened overnight. She stood in her driveway for a full minute, mouth open, before waving at my window with an expression that could only be described as delighted shock. But the moment I'd been waiting for came at 7:15 a.m., when Brenda's white Lexus appeared at the end of the street for her morning patrol. I watched her approach, maintaining her usual slow pace, clearly focused on her inspection routine. She was about 50 yards away when she noticed that something was different. The car slowed even further. Then it stopped completely. From my window, I could see Brenda's silhouette in the driver's seat, perfectly motionless. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she pulled forward slowly, her car creeping toward my house like she was approaching a crime scene. When she reached my driveway, she stopped again. Through the windshield, I could see her face clearly for the first time, and the expression was everything I'd hoped for and more. Shock, confusion, something that might have been panic. Her mouth was actually hanging open, and she gripped the steering wheel with both hands like she was trying to anchor herself to reality. She sat there for nearly 5 minutes, just staring. Other neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the spectacle of both the putting green and Brenda's obvious distress. Mrs. Rodriguez came over to get a closer look and actually applauded when she realized what she was seeing. Mr. Walsh shuffled across the street to examine the water feature, nodding his approval like he was reviewing a piece of fine art. Finally, Brenda got out of her car. She approached the edge of my property with the caution of someone entering a minefield.
Mrs. Thornfield, I'm afraid your board lacks any legal authority to order the removal of a county-permitted recreational facility that complies with all applicable regulations and covenant provisions. That's what my lawyer, David Kellerman, told Brenda in front of 37 neighbors packed into the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center on Thursday night, and the silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a measuring tape drop. But 18 hours earlier, when Brenda's emergency meeting notice appeared in every mailbox with the fury of someone whose perfect little dictatorship had just been challenged by superior firepower, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal HOA gathering. This was going to be a public execution. The question was whether I'd be the victim or the executioner. What Brenda didn't realize as she called this meeting was that she was about to face 30 years of golf course construction experience, a lawyer who specialized in municipal zoning law, and a stack of permits so thoroughly documented that they could survive a federal audit. You want to know what happens when an unstoppable force of bureaucratic rage meets the immovable object of perfectly legal suburban warfare? You're about to find out. The emergency meeting notice had been delivered Wednesday evening, less than 12 hours after my putting green reveal, hand-delivered to every house in the neighborhood by what I can only assume was Brenda personally, probably while muttering threats under her breath as she stuffed mailboxes with her fury. Emergency HOA board meeting, it read in letters so large and bold they practically screamed from the paper. Urgent, covenant violation requiring immediate community action. Thursday, October 17th, 7 p.m., Community Center. Attendance strongly encouraged. The language was more aggressive than usual, even for Brenda's standards. This wasn't a routine meeting about holiday decorations or garbage can placement. This was a declaration of war, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. I spent Thursday morning making preparations that would have impressed a defense attorney preparing for a murder trial. David Kellerman arrived at my house at 2 p.m., bringing with him the kind of legal firepower that made hourly rates look like mortgage payments. David specialized in municipal law and has spent 15 years fighting battles between developers and local governments, which meant he understood both the letter and the spirit of zoning regulations better than most judges. Mike, he said, as we spread the documents across my dining room table. "I've reviewed everything you've sent me, and I have to tell you, this is the most thoroughly documented recreational facility permit I've ever seen. You could build this thing next to City Hall with this level of compliance." We went through every document, every approval, every signature and seal that made my putting green legally bulletproof. County zoning compliance, municipal utility coordination, environmental impact assessments, even fire department approval for the water feature placement. The paper trail was so comprehensive it read like a government contractor's wet dream. You want to know what happens when an unstoppable force of bureaucratic rage meets the immovable object of perfectly legal suburban warfare? You're about to find out. The emergency meeting notice had been delivered Wednesday evening, less than 12 hours after my putting green reveal, hand-delivered to every house in the neighborhood by what I can only assume was Brenda personally, probably while muttering threats under her breath as she stuffed mailboxes with her fury. "Emergency HOA board meeting," it read in letters so large and bold they practically screamed from the paper. "Urgent, covenant violation requiring immediate community action. Thursday, October 17th, 7 p.m., Community Center. Attendance strongly encouraged." The language was more aggressive than usual, even for Brenda's standards. This wasn't a routine meeting about holiday decorations or garbage can placement. This was a declaration of war, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. I spent Thursday morning making preparations that would have impressed a defense attorney preparing for a murder trial. David Kellerman arrived at my house at 2 p.m., bringing with him the kind of legal firepower that made hourly rates look like mortgage payments. David specialized in municipal law and has spent 15 years fighting battles between developers and local governments, which meant he understood both the letter and the spirit of zoning regulations better than most judges. "Mike," he said, as we spread the documents across my dining room table, "I've reviewed everything you've sent me. And I have to tell you, this is the most thoroughly documented recreational facility permit I've ever seen. You could build this thing next to City Hall with this level of compliance." We went through every document, every approval, every signature and seal that made my putting green legally bulletproof. County zoning compliance, municipal utility coordination, environmental impact assessments, even fire department approval for the water feature placement. The paper trail was so comprehensive it read like a government contractor's wet dream. "What about their potential arguments?" I asked. David smiled the kind of smile that defense attorneys get when they realize the prosecution has no case. "They can argue all they want. The law is very clear about homeowners' rights to install permitted recreational facilities. The only way they could force removal is if you violated noise ordinances, exceeded setback requirements, or created a genuine public nuisance, none of which apply here." At 6:45 p.m., David and I walked into the Middlebrook Estates Community Center carrying 2 briefcases full of legal ammunition. The room was packed beyond capacity, with neighbors standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. I'd never seen this many people at an HOA meeting in 18 months I'd lived here, but then again, I'd never turned my front yard into Augusta National either. The energy in the room was electric. Conversations buzzed with excitement and anticipation, neighbors clustering in groups to discuss what they'd witnessed that morning. I caught fragments of discussion as we found seats in the back. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Can't believe someone actually stood up to her. Wonder how much it cost." But the most interesting dynamic in the room was the clear division in the room. About half the neighbors looked excited, almost giddy at the prospect of watching Brenda's authority challenged. The other half looked nervous, uncomfortable with anything that disrupted the established order of suburban control. Brenda entered at exactly 7 p.m., flanked by her usual board cronies, Janet Mills with her perpetual expression of disapproval, and Robert Chin clutching his tablet like a security blanket. But tonight, Brenda looked different. Gone was the smug confidence of the measuring tape incident. Tonight, she looked like a general who had just realized her army was surrounded. "This emergency meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association is called to order," she announced, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested she was running on pure adrenaline. We're here to address a serious violation of our community covenants that threatens the character and property values of our neighborhood." She gestured toward me without making eye contact. "Mr. Henderson has installed an unauthorized recreational facility that violates multiple provisions of our governing documents. The board has determined that this installation must be removed immediately to prevent further deterioration of community standards." The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. David stood up with the calm authority of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm David Kellerman, representing Mr. Henderson in this matter. Before the board makes any determinations about removal, I'd like to present some documents for your review." He walked to the front of the room and handed Brenda a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "These are copies of all county permits, zoning approvals, and covenant compliance documentation for Mr. Henderson's recreational sports facility. As you'll see, every aspect of this installation has been approved by the appropriate authorities and complies fully with both municipal regulations and your own governing documents." Brenda opened the folder and I watched her face change as she flipped through page after page of official approvals. The color drained from her cheeks, then returned in angry red patches. Her hands were visibly shaken by the time she reached the laminated copy of Section 14.7 that David had included as the final document. This doesn't matter," she stammered, clearly improvising now. "The installation violates the aesthetic character requirement. It's a public nuisance. It's inappropriate for a residential neighborhood." "Actually," David replied with perfect calm, "county zoning regulations specifically recognize recreational sports facilities as enhancement amenities that typically increase property values in residential areas. The aesthetic character requirement is met through the professional design and installation, which exceeds industry standards for similar facilities." Janet Mills jumped in, apparently deciding to help Brenda dig the hole deeper. "But what about noise? Golf courses generate noise from maintenance equipment, players, that sort of thing." "The facility is designed for putting practice, which generates no more noise than typical yard maintenance, and Mr. Henderson has voluntarily committed to limiting usage to daylight hours and weekends, though no such restriction is legally required." You could feel the mood in the room shifting. Neighbors who had come expecting to see me taking down a peg were instead watching their all-powerful HOA board get systematically demolished by superior preparation and legal expertise. Robert Chin tried a different approach. "What about precedent? If we allow this, everyone will want to install golf courses in their yards." "That would be wonderful," called out Mrs. Rodriguez from the middle of the room, and laughter rippled through the audience. "Maybe then our property values will actually go up instead of down." More laughter, and I could see Brenda's face getting redder. She was losing control of the room, losing the authority she'd wielded on this neighborhood for years, and she knew it. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced abruptly, gathering her papers with shaking hands. "Actually," David said politely, "under Robert's Rules of Order—"
Detective Morrison, we have clear video evidence of Mrs. Thornfield using what appears to be a crowbar to damage the irrigation control panel at approximately 2:47 a.m. That's what I told the detective 3 hours after discovering my putting green had been transformed into a suburban water park. But 12 hours earlier, when I'd gone to bed feeling victorious after the board meeting triumph, I had no idea that Brenda's whispered threat about other ways meant she was prepared to commit actual crimes to get her revenge. The sound that woke me at 5:23 a.m. wasn't my alarm clock or the morning garbage trucks. It was the unmistakable roar of high-pressure water escaping from a catastrophically damaged irrigation system, accompanied by what sounded like a small waterfall cascading off my front porch. But as I stumbled outside in my pajamas to witness what Brenda undoubtedly thought was her moment of triumph, I realized that her desperate act of vandalism had just handed me the kind of evidence that would end her HOA presidency, her reputation, and possibly her freedom. You want to know what happens when someone crosses the line from petty bureaucratic warfare to actual felony property destruction?
You're about to witness the most expensive mistake Brenda Thornfield ever made. The first thing that hit me when I opened my front door was the noise. Not just the sound of running water, but the violent hiss and spray of pressurized irrigation lines that had been deliberately severed. Water was erupting from at least 6 different locations across my putting green, creating geysers that shot 15 feet into the air before crashing down onto what had been, just hours earlier, championship-quality bentgrass. The second thing I noticed was the flooding. Water was cascading off my property onto the sidewalk, running down the storm drains, pooling in my neighbors' driveways. The carefully graded elevation of my putting green had become a series of lakes and waterfalls that would have looked beautiful if they weren't the result of deliberate sabotage. The third thing I saw was Brenda. She stood at the edge of her driveway across the street, still in her bathrobe and slippers, holding her phone up like she was filming a nature documentary. The expression on her face was pure satisfaction, the look of someone who thought they just delivered the perfect revenge. She wasn't even trying to hide her involvement. She was celebrating it. "Good morning, Mike," she called out, her voice carrying across the sound of rushing water with false cheerfulness. "Looks like you're having some irrigation problems." I stood on my porch, water soaking through my pajamas, and realized that Brenda had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Not because of the property damage, although that was certainly significant. Not even because of the obvious malice and premeditation involved. But because she had no idea that I'd learned, over 30 years of golf course construction, that the most dangerous threats to expensive installations weren't weather or wear, they were people. Which is why every component of my irrigation system was monitored by what Tommy had called industrial-grade security protocols. I pulled out my phone and opened the monitoring app that Tommy had installed as part of the system package. Immediately, I could see the pressure readings from each zone of the irrigation network. Normal pressure, 35 to 40 psi. Current readings, Zone 1, 0 psi. Zone 2, 0 psi. Zone 3, 127 psi and climbing, indicating a major line break with water backing up behind the damage. But more importantly, I could access the security camera footage. The system included 6 discrete cameras positioned around the property to monitor both the installation and any potential vandalism. They were motion-activated, infrared-capable, and configured to upload footage automatically to a cloud storage system that Tommy had linked to both my phone and my lawyer's office. I scrolled back to 2:47 a.m. and found exactly what I was looking for. The footage was better than I could have hoped for. Crystal clear infrared video showing a figure in dark clothing approaching the irrigation control panel that was mounted on the side of my house. The person was carrying what appeared to be a crowbar or similar tool, and they worked methodically to pry open the weatherproof housing that protected the system's electronic controls. But the real evidence came at 2:51 a.m. when the figure turned directly toward one of the cameras while fleeing the scene. The infrared lighting captured facial features clearly enough for positive identification, and there was no question about who was looking back at me from my phone screen. Brenda Thornfield had just committed felony vandalism in 4K resolution. I called David Kellerman first. "Mike," his voice was groggy with sleep, "it's 5:30 in the morning. This better be good. Brenda just sabotaged my irrigation system. I have video." There was a pause, then David's voice became sharp and alert. "Are you certain it's her?" Crystal clear facial identification. She used a crowbar to destroy the control panel, causing extensive flooding damage to my property. I've got pressure sensor data showing exactly when each line was compromised and security footage of the entire vandalism incident. Jesus Christ. Okay, don't touch anything. Don't talk to anyone. And whatever you do, don't confront her directly. I'm calling the police, and then I'm calling my insurance contact who handles high-value property claims. This just became a criminal matter. My second call was to Tommy, who arrived 30 minutes later with a crew and emergency equipment to shut off the water supply and assess the damage. The irrigation system was completely destroyed, not just broken, but systematically demolished with the kind of thoroughness that suggested hours of planning. "Mike," Tommy said as we surveyed the wreckage, "this wasn't random vandalism. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were targeting. They hit every major junction point, severed the main supply lines in multiple locations, and destroyed the electronic controls so completely that we'll need to replace the entire system." "How much damage are we talking?" Tommy walked the property, taking measurements and photographs while his crew worked to stop the flooding. "The irrigation system alone is probably $15,000 to replace. The bent grass is completely destroyed. That's another $20,000 for new sod and installation. Water damage to the sand bunkers, the lighting system, probably some foundation issues from the flooding." He shook his head. "You're looking at $40,000, maybe $50,000 in damages." $50,000. Brenda's little tantrum had just graduated from misdemeanor mischief to felony destruction of property. Detective Morrison arrived at 7:15 a.m., a middle-aged woman with the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variety of suburban crazy the world had to offer. She listened to my explanation, reviewed the video footage on my phone, and took detailed photographs of the damage. "Mr. Henderson," she said as we walked the property, "I have to ask, is there any ongoing dispute between you and Mrs. Thornfield that might have motivated this incident?" I gave her the complete timeline. The original grass violation, the measuring tape incident, the board meeting where her authority had been challenged, and her specific threat about finding other ways to handle problem residents. "So she made a direct threat in front of witnesses, and less than 48 hours later, your property was vandalized?" "That's correct." Detective Morrison nodded and made notes. "The video evidence is quite clear. We'll need to obtain a warrant to search Mrs. Thornfield's property for the tools used in this incident, but I'm confident we have sufficient evidence for arrest and prosecution." That's when things got interesting. As Detective Morrison was preparing to leave, Brenda appeared at the edge of my property. She'd changed out of her bathrobe into her standard HOA uniform of pressed khakis and polo shirt, and she approached us with the kind of confident stride that suggested she thought she was still in control of the situation. "Officer," she said to Detective Morrison, "I understand you're investigating this flooding incident. As president of our Homeowners Association, I want you to know that we've been having ongoing issues with this resident's non-compliant installation. I wouldn't be surprised if this was caused by improper construction or maintenance." Detective Morrison looked at Brenda with the expression of someone who just watched a criminal walk into a police station and confess. "Ma'am, are you Brenda Thornfield?" "Yes, I am." "Mrs. Thornfield, you're under arrest for felony destruction of property and criminal vandalism." The color drained from Brenda's face as Detective Morrison read her rights. She looked around frantically, as if searching for an escape route or someone who might intervene on her behalf. But the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness the aftermath of the flooding just watched in stunned silence as their all-powerful HOA president was handcuffed in the middle of Maple Ridge Drive. "This is ridiculous," Brenda protested.
Congratulations, Mr. Henderson, on creating what our editors are calling the most ingenious response to HOA tyranny in American suburban history. That's what the photographer from Golf Digest told me as he packed up his equipment after a 3-hour photo shoot that transformed my front yard into the cover story for their unconventional golf summer issue. But 6 months earlier, when I was standing in ankle-deep floodwater watching Brenda get arrested,
I never imagined that her act of desperate vandalism would become the catalyst for the most satisfying chapter of my entire retirement. The criminal charge is stuck, the civil lawsuit is still grinding through the courts like a slow-motion financial execution, and the HOA board that once terrorized this neighborhood with measuring tapes and violation letters has been completely transformed by residents who finally understand that suburban tyrants only have as much power as you're willing to give them. But the real victory isn't the money or the legal vindication or even the magazine feature. It's watching Brenda Thornfield load her belongings into a moving truck while 3 other neighbors practice their putting on golf courses that never would have existed if she just left my grass alone. You want to know what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong person and lose so spectacularly that it becomes a neighborhood legend? You're about to witness the final scorecard of the most expensive lesson in hubris that Meadowbrook Estates has ever seen. The transformation began immediately after Brenda's arrest. Within 48 hours, I had received calls from 7 different neighbors asking for Tommy's contact information, 2 requests for copies of the permit application process, and an invitation to join what Mrs. Patterson was calling the Meadowbrook Resistance Movement, though she was joking, mostly. The criminal case moved through the courts with the kind of efficiency that usually only happens on television. Brenda's lawyer tried everything, claiming the video evidence was doctored, arguing that she was sleepwalking, even suggesting that I had somehow manipulated her into committing vandalism as part of an elaborate frame job. But when you have 4K video footage of someone using a crowbar to destroy property at 2:47 a.m., creative legal theories tend to fall apart quickly. She pled guilty to felony destruction of property 3 weeks after the arrest, accepting a sentence that included 18 months probation, community service, restitution for the full cost of repairs, and immediate resignation from all HOA board positions. The judge apparently was not impressed with arguments about community standards and measuring tape enforcement. But the real damage to Brenda's life went far beyond the criminal conviction. The story went viral. I'm not sure who first posted the security footage online, though I suspect it was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become something of a social media expert in her retirement. The video of Brenda's sabotage operation, combined with photos of the damage and the story of the original grass violation, created the kind of internet sensation that destroys people's lives with surgical precision. HOA Karen destroys 50K golf course because grass was too tall became a headline that appeared on every major news website, social media platform, and suburban parent group in the country. The measuring tape video, which someone had apparently recorded from their window and saved for posterity, provided the perfect setup for Brenda's ultimate downfall. Within a week, she had been fired from her job at the insurance company where she'd worked for 15 years. Apparently, having your employee become the face of suburban tyranny and criminal vandalism creates what HR departments call reputational liability issues. The HOA board, meanwhile, had collapsed completely. Janet Mills resigned in embarrassment 2 days after Brenda's arrest. Robert Chen lasted another week before the constant hostile stares from neighbors convinced him that his measuring tape enforcement days were over. By the end of the month, we had a completely new board led by Mrs. Patterson, who ran on a platform of reasonable people making reasonable decisions about reasonable problems. The new board's first official act was to eliminate the grass height requirements entirely. Their second act was to approve recreational facility permits for anyone who wanted them, with the only requirement being county compliance and neighbor notification. By Christmas, Meadowbrook Estates looked like a suburban golf resort. The Rodriguez family installed a putting green that wrapped around their swimming pool. Mr. and Mrs. Chen from 2834 built what they called a meditation golf garden, complete with Zen water features and carefully raked sand patterns. The young couple from 2839 created a miniature golf course that their toddler could use, complete with windmills and tiny bridges that attracted kids from across the neighborhood. Even Mrs. Patterson got into the spirit, hiring Tommy to design what she called
a senior-friendly putting facility that doubled as a social gathering space for the growing number of neighbors who had discovered that golf-related landscaping was not only legal, but actually fun. The property values, contrary to Brenda's predictions, went up, way up. Meadowbrook Estates became the first neighborhood in the county to market itself as a recreational golf community, and suddenly houses that had been sitting on the market for months were selling above asking price to families who wanted to live somewhere that encouraged creativity instead of punishing it. Golf Digest found us through a tip from someone who had seen the viral videos and recognized that my putting green was something special. The photographer who came to document America's most creative home golf course ended up spending 3 days in the neighborhood taking pictures not just of my installation, but of the growing collection of residential golf facilities that had sprouted like mushrooms after rain. "I've been photographing golf courses for 20 years, he told me as he packed up his equipment, and I've never seen anything like this. You've created a community that celebrates golf instead of just tolerating it. This is revolutionary." Revolutionary. That's what a simple response to a grass violation had become. But the sweetest moment of all came on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 months after the original violation letter had started this whole adventure. I was on my front porch with my morning coffee, practicing putts on the rebuilt green that the insurance settlement had made even more beautiful than the original, when I saw the moving truck pull up in front of Brenda's house. She had been trying to sell for 3 months, ever since the criminal conviction made staying in the neighborhood impossible. The house was listed at $485,000 initially, then dropped to $450,000 when nobody showed interest in buying the former home of the internet's most famous HOA tyrant. It finally sold for $425,000 to a young family who apparently didn't spend much time online and just wanted a nice house in a golf-friendly neighborhood. I watched Brenda load boxes with the kind of methodical sadness that comes from having your entire life dismantled by your own poor decisions. She moved slowly, avoiding eye contact with neighbors, probably aware that several people were watching her final departure from behind their windows. When she carried the last box to the truck, she stopped at the edge of her driveway and looked across the street at my putting green. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something that might have been regret, or maybe just exhaustion. She got in her car and drove away without looking back. Mrs. Patterson appeared on her porch as the moving truck pulled away, waving at me with obvious satisfaction. "Mike," she called over, "I just want you to know that you've done something important here. Not just the golf course, though that's beautiful, but showing people that they don't have to live in fear of petty tyrants with measuring tapes." She was right, of course. The putting green had just been the beginning. The real victory was the transformation of an entire community that had been terrorized by bureaucratic overreach into a place that celebrated creativity instead of punishing it. That afternoon, I got a call from a reporter at the Washington Post who was working on a story about HOA reform movements across the country. Apparently, the Meadowbrook model was being studied by municipal governments and homeowners associations who wanted to understand how to encourage community engagement without creating suburban police states. "Mr. Henderson," the reporter asked, "what advice would you give to other homeowners who are dealing with aggressive HOA enforcement?" I thought about that for a moment. Looking out at my putting green where Mrs. Chen was practicing her short game while her grandchildren played on the playground equipment that the new board had approved for the common area, I said, "Document everything. Know your rights. Understand that HOA boards derive their power from homeowner apathy, and the moment residents decide to engage, tyrants like Brenda Thornfield become obsolete. Sometimes the best response to unreasonable authority is spectacular, legal, and very public non-compliance." The article ran 3 weeks later with the headline, "How One Man's Putting Green Sparked a Suburban Revolution." It included photographs of the neighborhood's various golf installations, interviews with residents about the transformation from HOA police state to creative community, and a sidebar about property value increases in neighborhoods that embrace recreational facilities.
But for me, the real satisfaction came from simpler moments, like watching kids from across the neighborhood practice their putting after school, like seeing elderly neighbors gather around Mrs. Patterson's social putting green for evening games that had become a community tradition, like receiving thank you cards from families who had moved to Meadowbrook specifically because of the golf-friendly culture we'd created. 6 months after receiving a $500